Conversations 2024. KHA is a platform for knowledge sharing among scholars, policymakers, civil society groups, and government officials working within African countries on key challenges Africans are facing today. KHA engages in discussions and debates in key areas such as the socio-economic and political dynamics of climate change, natural resource extraction, political ecologies, and economies of development, with a particular emphasis on Africa. Today, we have our co-host, Professor KHA, who is based at Rhodes University in South Africa, and he's going to be in conversation with Sarah Makumbe. Sarah Makumbe is passionate about sustainable practices and takes a leading role in implementing certifications such as IRMA, CopperMark, ICMM, and towards sustainable mining. This work offers impartial insights into the mining sector's impact and identifies opportunities for sustainability improvements that benefit both communities and the environment. Beyond mining, she collaborates with customers, investors, and governments to encourage ethical sourcing and responsible conduct throughout the metal supply chain. Her efforts have led to her recognition as one of Mining Journal's most influential people in mining for 2023. With over 15 years of experience in mining, her skills range from metallurgy, process engineering, business improvement, safety, and sustainability. Over to you, Kik and Sarah.
Well, thank you, Joshua, for that invitation and introduction. And thank you, Sarah, so much for having this conversation with us today. We really appreciate it deeply. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. I was quite thrilled to get an opportunity to participate in this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it as well.
Okay, so Sarah, what we're going to discuss today are questions around the mining industry with specific reference to social and environmental certification, or whatever phrase you'd like to use. And we're going to be going through 4 key points in terms of these certifications. First of all, arguments for voluntary certification. Secondly, limitations around the certification process. Thirdly, drawbacks and mitigations. And then fourthly, advice that you think is important for various sectors which are attached or relevant to the mining industry. So the first issue pertains to the certifications themselves, that despite whatever regulations might exist, whether at a national level or otherwise, with regard to regulating the mining industry, why do you think voluntary social and environmental certification is of some significance for the mining industry and the work they do? Thank you.
Thanks, Kirk. I think a good place is to start from the top, as you said. What is the relevance of mining certifications, and why should the industry take note of them? So perhaps to set context for any listeners who might not be familiar with mining certifications and the process involved with it, mining certifications are a voluntary standard that a mining company signs up for because they want to be audited against that standard. So it's a voluntary process. It's not mandatory, like the way regulation would be mandatory, depending on your host country laws and the expectation to comply with them. So this, in essence, is seen as a step that companies would take over and above meeting their regulatory practices. What happens with mining certifications is that you would select a third-party auditor who is conversant with the standard, and they would undertake some assurance process to verify your performance against the standards requirements. And there's different types of assessment processes, following which you then get an audit report that highlights what your performance is and your opportunities for improvement in the sustainability space. Broadly speaking, mining certifications or standards tend to cover a broad range of topics. If you think of ESG as covering environmental, social, and governance, quite a lot of the standards would cover different types of topics under those themes, looking at things like air quality, water quality, efficiencies in the use of water, for example. They'll look at your social aspects, being reviewed against your human rights violations, if any at all. What happens in terms of child labor. They'll look at your community relations, the implications of the mining operations on community safety. And then they'll also touch on things around governance, looking at revenue payments and transparency, wanting to know what measures have been put in place around, closure of the mine, rehabilitation, and generally planning for positive legacies post the life of the mine. So a very comprehensive set of topics is generally covered, for which you are then measured by a third-party auditor for. Now, the question of, if you have regulation, why do you also need this? And if you are implementing regulation requirements, as well as your own mining standards, for which a lot of companies have got their own standards of what best practice looks like, why would you then need an external third party to come into the mix? And I think for me, the answer to that question is that, firstly, the regulations are different across different countries. Whereas when you look at commodity value chains, they are global. So you might be producing material from a region that has got weaker regulations, for example. But if you can demonstrate performance at high bar standards, that for products that are going to be delivered in a global context, you're starting to standardize the expectation around your sustainability performance. So trying to close the gap between differing regulation schemes that are available. And then on the second point, where you're looking at mining companies themselves having their own standards, we've got a lot of news available that talks to how mining companies have also failed against their own standards. So a lot of topics around impact on cultural heritage, tailings dam failures and the implications for communities around, and even just some significant mining health and safety related incidents that have resulted in great harm and impact. So mining, you would say, has lost its right to self-governance and to being measured by its own bar of practice. So you'd find that sustainability standards start to help to demonstrate where organizations or sites are at in terms of that sustainability performance, as a way of building credibility around the performance and the progress that is happening. So in a case where the industry has lost out on its own credibility, you start to look at other opportunities to demonstrate your performance and the continuous improvement that mine sites might be making towards that. And then maybe just the last point being that by signing up to do these voluntary standards, it's not something that mining companies do because they're perfect. You'd find that for a lot of the standards or certifications, the theory of change is one of continuous improvement, whereby you'd enter a certification scheme at a particular level with the commitment to use the feedback from the audits to improve over time. So as opposed to coming in and you are perfect and this is a checklist, a lot of the standards that are coming out are driving for that continuous improvement, for which I've got experiences in seeing how mining sites that started out with certain challenges, or maybe challenges around prioritization. So the non-conformances were known to the site, but through this implementation of certifications and understanding the impact of your non-conformances on risk, the prioritization of closing out those non-conformances identified by the audits has led to sustainability improvements. And while mining is new to this journey, in the raw materials sector, you'll find that the forestry companies already went ahead years before through implementation of standards such as the FSC, the marine sector as well. So what we're seeing in mining, I think, is a natural evolution over time that has come as consumers are starting to demand and want to know more about the credentials. Has there been any human rights impact or environmental violations as a result of the products that they're purchasing? So that's where it's come from.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Thank you so much. Just a couple of follow-up questions. When you refer to third parties, I mean, what type of organization are you talking about as a third party in setting up these certifications?
Sure. So I think if you look at the architecture of certifications, firstly, there is the standard or the certification company, for which examples are, as Joshua mentioned, the likes of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA. There's also Coppermark, which is specific to the base metal commodities, leading with copper. So there are the standard bodies that create these certifications. I think in that space of the standard bodies, you'll find that there are different types of models. There are some standards that have been developed by mining companies themselves coming together, and those are known as sort of industry schemes, right? Where the industry is saying, let's create a standard that recognizes what good looks like, and we aim to all work towards that standard. Then more recently, we have also seen the evolution of multi-stakeholder governance standards, where in the standard governance, there are different actors, including mining companies. You'd find communities are represented, purchasing companies who are buying upstream material from mining companies would be represented, finance, representation of indigenous people, communities, labor, and that multi-stakeholder governance approach tends to have a lot more credibility because the standard or the measure of what good looks like has been designed using the contribution of different actors. Then once you have that standard that a mining company voluntarily signs up for, in most cases, or if it's an industry scheme, it can be a condition of your membership to say if you're a member of the scheme, you will comply with this standard because that is what we stand for in terms of our values, right? But once you sign up for that standard, you would need to be audited, for which you need the third-party auditors, which was what your question was, are recognized certification bodies or assessors. So these are people who are skilled in the topics, have experience in the mining sector, for example, and they are not part of your organization, neither are they part of the standards that have set. So they are accredited to come and check your compliance. And there's different types of organizations that are fulfilling this requirement of providing third-party auditing that is meant to be independent, that is meant to be objective, and then gives you a report that tells you how you are performing based on how they have assessed. So they would be impartial to your organization and trying to just assess your performance against the standard requirements.
Okay, and just a second question. Insofar these are voluntary arrangements, and there isn't an assessment by the third party as to whether the mining company or industry is fulfilling its obligations in terms of the certification. Are these compliance reports publicly available?
That is a good question. Yeah. I think what we are finding is that there is an increased demand for transparency around the auditing process. Have you engaged with diverse views? So not just the mining companies' evidence that you're assessing. How have you triangulated it with other information from your stakeholders, your communities, the neighbors of the mining company, as well as other reports that are out there, but ultimately leading to transparency through the report that is published. So we are finding that there's different levels of transparency within the certification schemes, ranging from some who publicly notice the audits that are upcoming so that stakeholders are aware that there's an audit process and how to participate if they wanted to participate. Some that mandate a minimum expectation around stakeholder engagement to get diverse views. And then the level of public disclosure differs, right? With some standards, such as the IRMA standard, producing detailed reports on how a site is performing against the requirements publicly, or some that will give a summary of the performance across different areas. So the levels of transparency are differing, but there seems to be a trend towards, more transparency in the standards reports that are then produced, so that clarity on what is really happening at a mine site. Can we say that by purchasing from this operation, we understand the approach that is being taken to significant sustainability risks? So transparency is a key driver for this work, and you'll find that the way that mining companies are approaching this depends on their value chain. So what is the expectation of your customers and your customers' customers? Where you have a lot of consumer-facing goods, you'll find that there's a lot of appetite for understanding the transparency. If you think of products going into the making of batteries, critical minerals, such as those, consumers who are buying those cars are very interested in understanding the sustainability credentials, and then also the impact of geography. So where are these products going into, and what is that region's prioritization of sustainability? It also makes a difference on that uptake of, conducting sustainability standards by mining actors.
Okay, no, thanks, Sarah, for that. Well, we've discussed what the mechanisms are and what possibly what they're meant to do and what the potential is. Just in terms of any limitations that you consider which are currently of some significance from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's good for us to talk about these limitations because mining certifications are not the silver bullet that will fix all and solve all our problems. You'll find that, for example, the audits are static, so they happen at a particular point in time. You'll get a snapshot of the performance of that operation at that time, for which it can tell you insightful things, but also it has limitations. You'll find that the audits are not a continuous exercise. They happen at specified frequency, for which in between there's an opportunity for things to either improve or deteriorate, or for there to be significant environmental impacts or human rights impacts on communities that are negative, that are not picked out in between the audits. So I guess in saying this, it's to say that by doing certifications or implementation of certification schemes, is not the only mechanism for due diligence in mining value chains, but it is one mechanism that is important and needs to be well understood. I think the other thing to do with certifications is also that the uptake is still fairly new, therefore the assessor quality is also still improving, especially when you think of things like social audits that are involving stakeholders, which are not typically how mining companies have operated in the past. So I think there's a lot of learning still happening in the certification world, especially with mining, as this is still fairly new and the complexities of mining operations differ with each region. I think also maybe the last point I'll bring out around limitations are that, as with any audit protocol, there's a sampling methodology that is involved. Therefore, that will have its own limitations. We find, for example, having engaged in social audits, there are sometimes a certain perception that we don't think it was comprehensive enough, or just because I was not chosen to participate, this was not representing the views of everyone. And I think that is a real limitation. It's not a door-to-door undercover investigation. The fact that the mining company is voluntarily paying for it means that firstly they want to engage, but it also creates a certain level of bias or distrust that comes with it. It's not covering the whole spectra of people or stakeholders, and there can be that feeling that it wasn't comprehensive enough, and it's not an undercover operation. So I think in that way, it will have limitations and perhaps also won't meet full stakeholder expectations that they may start to have around the topic. So I think it's important that the limitations of certifications are understood and are also I suppose brought up front, because then that helps to create a better proposition for what are you getting and what are you not getting and what those limitations are, but bearing in mind that there's still some value despite the limitations. So I think it's a very good question you bring about to discuss the limitations as well.
So you mentioned that their application to the mining industry is relatively new compared to forestry, etc. I mean, is there evidence which indicates that the mining industry, I mean, are there instances in which a particular mining company has sought to engage in multiple assessments or compliance exercises? Or is it typically just a once-off arrangement?
Yeah, that's a good point. In as much as the mining standards are still new, or standards and certifications are new in mining relative to other sectors, it hasn't deterred standard makers from developing and designing loads of standards. So if anything, there's a plethora of standards available on the market, ranging from some that are commodity specific, such as the RJC, Responsible Jewelry Council, looking at commodities used in the jewelry sector. And as such, some are market based. So in that case, it's a jewelry standard. So it's looking at the jewelry value chain, quite different from a responsible steel standard, looking at raw materials and processes involved in the steel manufacturing space. Some aim to be cross-commodity, such as the ICMM, mining principles, performance expectations, the IRMA standard. Some cover different parts of the value chain, upstream where the mining operations are, or also including processes and refiners along the way. So quite a lot of standards and initiatives, and with new ones still underway and being developed. We're also seeing a move towards convergence of standards. There is a project underway looking to see convergence of 4 standards, the copper mark, which is specific to base metals, World Gold Council, specific to gold, together with TSM, which is towards sustainable mining, multi-sector, multi-country type of standard, and the ICMA mining principles also looking broader. So all of this to try and clarify the landscape and to raise the bar of standards through the initiative of consolidation. So because of the plethora of standards, you'll find that for some companies, they have to do multiple standards. You might do one because you're a member of a particular organization, let's say such as World Gold Council, but at the same time, your customers are familiar with the Responsible Jewelry Council certification, and they want to purchase a standard that comes from that recognizes that Responsible Jewelry Council standard, because that's what they've signed up for as a customer.
Yeah.
So we are starting to see quite a lot of standards and the increased burden on mining sites as a result. So I think it becomes important to then understand, as a mining actor or even as a stakeholder interested in the mining industry, what makes credible standards, because not all standards are the same, right? So if you look at the different types of standards and the different reports, some of them written by academics, some of them written by civil society actors advocating for the impacts of mining on communities, they've started to create a picture of what makes a credible standard, for which I'd like to share some of the insights I found in this work. I think it's looking at the governance of that standard, right? Is it a multi-stakeholder governed standard where you are having diverse inputs into what does good look like in that standard, as well as the governance of that standard? I think there's a clear recognition that you can't just have mining actors saying this is the standard. But at the same time, it's true that as much as many people can contribute to the governance, only the mining sector themselves carry the burden of the implementation. So I think working out that multi-stakeholder governance is an important point to really understand and to clarify for the standards that you're choosing. How are they approaching that? And what is the perception of credibility of that standard and the governance of that standard? So that's the first point. The second thing is the one of transparency that you mentioned earlier on. So, to what extent are these audits transparent, the reports transparent, and the information available for different stakeholders to be able to engage in? I think for a long time, mining practices are quite opaque. And yes, while they're trying to ensure that this has a global reach, the impacts of mining are often quite local. So what is the implications of mining on the local community around that? So the issue of transparency is important. The comprehensive nature of the standard is also key. To what extent is it covering the risks that are significant in that value chain, in that geography, and that are also expected by different actors who will be buying your products. So the comprehensive nature of your standard is also important. And I think the other point I'd like to mention is that point around related to transparency and governance is the input. How are you collecting the input into this auditing process? That stakeholder engagement and participation and just ensuring that it's not only the viewpoint of the mining company. So it's not the mining company saying, here's our attendance registers for the activities we've done in our community, but it's also hearing from the communities their perceptions of the events for which those attendance registers were collected. So I think that starts to point a different picture, but also to clarify perceptions across the stakeholders of a mining company's operation. So I think that's how I would also approach the topic on understanding the differences in standards and what makes it more credible, what makes them more credible.
Okay, that's interesting. Just two follow-up questions. One about, you mentioned variation in standards, and I imagine there must be variations because it's specific to particular subsectors of the industry, for instance. But is there a tendency to, at times, have a very minimalistic standard, so to speak? And in certain instances, I mean, I can imagine, for instance, a country which might have in terms of its regulations, might be very weak in terms of social and environmental protection and labor standards, etc. And the voluntary certification might only be something somewhat higher than what that country's regulations entail. So I'm raising this in the context of convergence, which you mentioned, convergence in terms of the quality of the certification, because I imagine the convergence could move downwards or could also move upwards. And I'm assuming that the mining industry would want to converge in such a manner that the standards are higher than lower, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I'm glad you've touched on it because it's exactly that, right? So is it a race to the bottom? Are these standards going to drive convergence that leads to a race to the bottom? Or is it going to be that a rising tide floats all boats? So as we converge, the tide gets higher for everyone and we see a sustainability improvement around it. I think the way I would like to answer this is to maybe bring out a case study in the forestry sector that I studied, I think 2 years ago, where similar to mining as well, when certifications started gaining momentum in the forestry sector, there was also a plethora of standards that started to come out. But what was clear was that the bar for credibility of standards had been set maybe through the likes of the FSC standard. So because that became the bar of what good looked like from diverse stakeholders in the value chain. And I think having the value chain conversation starts to sharpen what that bar looks like as well. So I think if I draw from that example and say that, the fact that there's a lot of interest in the mining value chain, whether it's like, for example, the automotive industry, where you see participation by automotive companies in the standards themselves. So a keen interest of what is the quality, what are our consumers expecting from us? Therefore, how is that represented in the standard? How will we be able to get assurance through the assurance, excuse the pen, but how will we get assurance through the audits that there are no human rights impacts, the environmental impacts have been managed appropriately? And I think that value chain interest is also contributing to what that bar looks like of what success looks like. Likewise, we're seeing investor interest that led to, for example, the formation of the GISTM standard, which is a standard for tailings management following disasters that had been experienced in the tailings management space, and seeing that multi-stakeholder dialogue that was also involved in the creation of that opportunity, where communities are represented and understand what that standard needs to look like to avoid that harm that we saw. So I think there's a lot of checkpoints coming in to ensure that that bar for global value chains continues to increase. But likewise, the limitation, I guess, still exists in that it's still a voluntary process. You'll find that maybe for certain commodities, they're starting to almost be aggregation towards a particular standard because of the convergence of maybe value chain actors saying we now recognize this particular standard and therefore starts to push for that bar in certain commodities. But because mining products are quite different, maybe compared to forestry. I think the journeys and the pathways are going to be different for each of the commodities. But generally, the bar for what success looks like has got a few mechanisms that are in place to try and protect that as well.
Okay, well, thank you. The second issue, just to follow up on what you said already, the significance of the certification mechanism simply not as a product, the actual standards which are set, but the process itself, leading to the formation of the certification standards, a participatory process. Is there any unevenness across the industry in terms of the extent to which there's an inclusive engagement with people affected, stakeholders, their involvement in the actual establishment of these standards?
Yes, I think there is a lot of unevenness. You'll find that, for example, where a lot of schemes were initiated through the industry schemes. So you'd find the dominance coming from mining sector participants. And I think sometimes the challenges of multi-stakeholder partnership, where there are different viewpoints but trying to aim for a same outcome, it means that decision making can be slower, can be difficult and challenging, but trying to make sure that those diverse interests are still represented. I think there's also sometimes a perception of unevenness where where some standards can have more civil society or non-mining actors, if I should call it, yet the burden of implementation comes to mining companies. But likewise, which on this spectrum of low participation of mining companies to only participation of mining companies, where does credibility sit, where does participatory and inclusiveness sit, and where is that sweet spot for ensuring that there's progress being delivered because of the way that the standards have been set up. So I think that is a process that is difficult and also creates unevenness. However, I would like to, I guess, give my own hypothesis that where you then work through and are patient to bring out that multi-stakeholder dialogue and making room for various sectors and taking them along, you end up with greater advocacy from diverse players, which is perhaps something that mining crucially needs as well, right? Where it's not just the mining company saying we're good at this, hey, and this is what it looks like. We've met our bar of our schemes and therefore we're doing well. But it's also the recognition of, we see the efforts being made by mining companies because this is what we're hearing from communities around them. And, these are some of the examples. I recently came across article written by a civil society organization in Zimbabwe that is a member of IRMA. It's called ZELA, Zimbabwe Environmental Lawyers Association. And in that article, they were acknowledging the effects of an IRMA standard audit at a mine in Shurugwi for the impact it has had on the community, to an extent that they detailed specific things that have changed through the implementation of that. So I think for me, that's a good example where you end up with new alliances and partners that typically have not had opportunities to meet and say, this is what we're all journeying towards. But creation of that multi-stakeholder platform also trickles down to local levels where you start then getting different advocates for your work, which is a good place to be, I believe, and starts to turn the narrative for the mining companies as well.
Okay. I just want to ask one further question and then allow you to raise any other issues you'd like to raise. And that question just simply pertains to the situation in Africa, the extent to which things are happening in terms of voluntary compliance arrangements in Africa in the mining industry. I'm not necessarily asking you to focus on any particular country or sector, but just to get a sense of your thoughts on what is taking place or not taking place in Africa, broadly speaking. I know that generalizing is problematic, but just a sweeping statement or discussion possibly. Thanks.
So I guess the best way I can do it is to substantiate with what I've seen, bearing in mind that there could be also other activities that I'm not familiar with in this space. So I think if I look at the implementation of certifications in Africa and the deployment of these standards, I think for one, I would say that we've been early movers in the diamond value chain through, I think, the involvement of organizations such as De Beers in the creation of the RJC standard, the Responsible Jewelry Council standards. So I guess in some ways we see success there of driving a standard for sustainability performance in the diamond value chains. A lot of it driven, from my understanding, by just trying to verify which ones were conflict-free diamonds, and what are some of the processes, and also I guess the evolution of the Kimberley process meant to help to understand where diamonds had come from in that. So you'll find that for several diamond mines or operations in Africa, they have been having these RJC audits for a long time now, and they are part of the value chain. It's also a well understood value chain standard that stretches from the mine through to manufacturing all the way to the retail stores. So it carries that chain of custody, if you like, and recognition. So I think that's a good place to start. Then you'll find also following that with the I think it was the 3TG minerals in the conflict areas around DRC. The EU conflict minerals regulation started advocating for the use of standards to differentiate between like your 3TG products that were coming out from that region. So already there we saw certain standards coming out in the Great Lakes regions as well, trying to differentiate products that were coming out and the sustainability credentials of those products. Then going beyond that, I think we see implementation of standards because of membership conditions. So some of the mining companies that are members of, the likes of ICMM or World Gold Council have started to go on journeys to implement specific standards. And this is across the continent, right? So, depending on where your operations are. But now if you look at commodity specific trends beyond the diamond one, I think a new one I'm starting to see come out is one in the PGM space, the platinum group metal space, where I think, driven maybe by the interest of automotive manufacturers who use platinum group metals for their auto catalysts, we are seeing an increase in implementation of the IRMA standard in that particular commodity. So if you look in the last sort of 5 years, there have been, several audits done by companies now. Some are already indicating that they want to do those audits through their associations, recognizing that this is where the industry is going. So you start to see that mechanism of market sector driving for a particular standard, which should hopefully drive a particular performance coming out. So I think commodity specific wise, we're also starting to see that. I do understand that standard companies or bodies like the Towards Sustainable Mining are also talking to mineral councils in the region, as they did, for example, in Botswana, to advocate for the implementation of, for example, Towards Sustainable Mining in Botswana. So I understand that they have an arrangement of that kind where mining companies in Botswana would then need to comply with the TSM standard as a condition of their membership. Likewise, there are also conversations underway in South Africa with the Minerals Council of South Africa to perhaps look at further opportunities like that. So I think inside of Africa, there definitely is a lot of activity and new mines going through for implementation. Some of them might be standalone commodities. I think I noticed that there's a graphite mine in Mozambique. There's also heavy sands operation in Senegal. That have all, committed to public orders through, for example, the IRMA process. There's an operation in DRC going through the copper mark. It's a copper producing operation. So I think if we had a bar chart plotting the increase, I would anticipate that we're seeing increased number of operations signing up to certifications in Africa. But I think that would be a good study to take away after the call for myself.
Just to follow up, and this is not necessarily specifically an Africa question, but what happens in cases where it's a foreign government investment or corporation or state enterprise which is involved in a mining operation in Africa or elsewhere.
So is this the case where the funding is coming from an external government and,
Yes.
developing a
Yeah.
mining operation?
Yeah, well, there might be some links to a foreign investment funds or a state enterprise. I'm not too sure whether that actually happens, but I'm just wondering whether there might be cases like that.
So I personally am not familiar, though that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Though I think ultimately one way to look at it would be to say what products are going to come out of that entity and what are the expectation of that product in that value chain. And I think that is what would then drive some of the decisions taken. So let's assume that this foreign investment is going into a copper facility, which is quite relevant because of copper's importance in the critical minerals and the energy transition, right? So,
Yeah.
because of the importance of copper and the high demand for sustainable copper, you might find that that entity might be looking at, for example, a standard like the copper mark, even though the funding is foreign or whatever it is, because of the way that the copper mark has started to drive for market share in the copper sector. So I think the fact that over 33% of the world's supply is certified through copper mark. And I think the stats are that 50% of copper from the world's biggest top 20 mines is already copper mark certified, means that there's something about market access that comes by having copper mark that you might consider regardless of where your investment has come from. So I think there'll be things around that. There are also other players who are looking at it from a perspective of how do we develop the mines at high bar standards, therefore use the standards to guide their policies, the implementation of the policies, so that they're already operating at those high bar standards as well. So I think there's a few cases to be considered, even with investment coming from, say, a foreign government source as well.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Are there any other issues that we haven't discussed that you'd like to raise at the end of this conversation?
Yeah, sure. I think an interesting issue that is starting to emerge is the issue around traceability and provenance. So where has this material come from and how can we, trace it, track it, and be confident about the provenance? I think also, key concerns around mixing of products from different countries and the implications where you've got geopolitical restrictions around getting material from certain geographies. But yet at the same time, the way that mining materials are sold and traded makes it a very complex issue to solve for. So I think there's going to be very interesting challenges coming up where you've got sustainability certifications to give your credentials, but then the processes of then tracing, tracking, and keeping the provenance of that material becomes more difficult because it's gone into fabrication and all sorts of processes. So I think that's the one trend that I'm seeing. But likewise, I'm also curious to perhaps suggest that there should be more cross-sector collaboration. So how do you learn from other raw material sectors that are facing similar challenges? How can we use lessons from other industries to accelerate the learnings in mining? And what does it look like to actually get more of that cross-sector shared understanding? So I think there's something there that I'm curious about as well. And I think lastly, just saying that the mining story and the role of certifications is not one that only needs mining companies to talk about, but I think the more we can have diverse sectors around the table understanding how mining works, what are the implications, and what does it look like when mining is done responsibly across the board, I think that will help to elevate some of the work that the industry is doing. So I think those would be perhaps some of my closing remarks, Kirk, as we get to the top of the podcast.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I mean, I must say I've learned quite a lot today in just less than an hour, and I'm sure listeners will learn a lot as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure on behalf of Joshua, I'd like to thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Yes,
Thank you very
thank you,
much.
Kik and Sarah, and for this illuminating discussion. And would like to thank our viewers as well who regularly visit our channel and website for updates. And if you want to stay up to date with the webinars and conversations we conduct, we encourage you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Knowledge Hub Africa, or visit our website at kha.africa.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.